How can we make our kindergarten to grade 12 education system fully accessible to students with all kinds of disabilities so that they can be fully included and fully participate on a footing of equality? My name is David Lepofsky. I'm a visiting professor at the Osgoode Hall Law School, and I'm also a chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance. I'd like to explore this topic. Imagine a school system in which all students could fully participate and be fully included. Imagine a school system where students with any kind of disability, whether it's a physical disability, a mental disability, an intellectual disability, a learning disability, a mental health condition, an intellectual disability, a communication disability, any kind of disability. Imagine them going to a school system that was designed from the start as if they were to be full and equal participants in the program. That's our dream. It's a dream that can become a reality. Let me offer you a roadmap for getting there. This will interest you if you have a disability, or if you're the parent or sibling or grandparent or other relative or friend of a student with a disability, or if there's any potential that in the future you could become a parent of a disability. This will interest you if you are involved in the education system in any way. You're a teacher, an educational assistant or special needs assistant, you're a principal or vice principal, you're a senior school board administrator, you're an elected public trustee of the school board, or you work in some capacity at the Ministry of Education. If you're a politician at any level, this topic will matter to you. Put simply, this matters to everyone. Disability is a very prevalent fact in our society. In Ontario, upwards of 2.6 million people have a disability. In our publicly funded education system, that's school boards that are funded by the public, there are 2 million students. Fully a third of a million of them or more have a disability. That's 1 out of every 6 kids at least. And that's just the ones we know about. There has never been a top to bottom review of our kindergarten to grade 12 education system to see whether it effectively serves the learning needs of students with disabilities, and if not, what needs to be done about it. There hasn't been up until very recently here in Ontario. I have the privilege of being part of that process. I'd like to explain what it's all about and give you an insight into what it yielded. Put simply, it yielded a report submitted to the Ontario government in 2021, which details what the barriers are in the education system facing students with disabilities, why they need to be fixed, and how to fix them. It's a comprehensive report which has several distinctive, if not unique, features. First, it's independent of government. It was not prepared by the government for the government. It was prepared by a standards development committee on K-12 education, appointed under the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. I had the privilege of leading the campaign to get the government to agree to appoint such a committee, and I served on the committee as one of its members. Our report has the advantage that it was the consensus view of a member of a committee that was 50% drawn from the disability community and disability sector, and 50% from educators, teachers' unions, school boards, school board officials, elected trustees. It is a committee that was originally appointed by a Liberal government in Ontario, but was later kept in place without changes by a successive conservative government in Ontario. So it has the imprint, if you will, or prior approval in its composition by two very different political parties. Its recommendations are the result of a very substantial consensus. I think most of the recommendations passed unanimously, but any of them needed at least a 75% vote in favor, and that had to include 50% support from the disability sector representatives. So it's a strong consensus view between those from bringing a disability perspective and those bringing the perspective of educators. That's not all. This report was submitted to the public in draft several months before it was finally submitted to the government. I have to correct, it was submitted in 2022. A draft of the report was made public in the spring of 2021. And under the provisions of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, it had to be made available for public comment. Well, a lot of members of the public commented. That feedback was sent in its entirety to all members of this Standards Development Committee. We all read it. We incorporated the feedback into our final report. What's critical from the outset is to know that the public feedback overwhelmingly agreed with the disability barriers that the committee's draft report had identified. It said we were right, those barriers really exist, and overwhelmingly agreed with the direction of the recommendations that the committee's report was to propose. That feedback was incorporated into a final report, and it's that report that I'm going to summarize for you. But it's important to understand that this report reflects a consensus view from disability community representatives and school board representatives and educator representatives. It reflects a consensus endorsement from substantial public input during the consultation process. So for anyone looking to carry out reform in this area, they can turn to this report as a substantial basis to get to work. There is a significant emphasis in our education system now on the important topic of equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI. This report fits squarely within an EDI agenda. Any effort at promoting equity, diversity, and inclusion for students in the school system must, as a central component, involve implementing the recommendations in the report that I'm going to be describing. And to leave disability out or downplay it would fly in the face of commitments of equity and inclusion. It would result in inequity and exclusion. Equity, diversity, inclusion is all about eliminating hierarchies. It is essential for disability, the needs of students with disabilities, to be central to such efforts, or else an old hierarchy will be replaced with a new hierarchy at which students with disabilities will languish at the bottom. Just a brief word on my involvement in this. My involvement goes back a long ways. Over 40 years ago, I was involved as a young law student and then new lawyer in efforts to get disability included in the equality provision of our proposed new Charter of Rights. I and many others worked on this. We succeeded. I was also involved with many others in advocating to get disability included in the Ontario Human Rights Code. We succeeded there too. In combination, the Charter of Rights and the Human Rights Code requires that students with disabilities not only get an education, but get an equal education that they are fully included in, fully benefit from, and fully participate in all that our education system has to offer. What I'm talking about in this lecture implements those legal rights. I led the fight from 1994 to 2005, led by a coalition that I chaired called the Ontarians with Disabilities Act Committee that campaigned to win the enactment in 2005 of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or AODA. I now chair the coalition that campaigns to get that law effectively enforced. Our coalition was the leading voice that pressed for the Ontario government to agree to develop an education accessibility standard under the AODA. And that's what this report that I'm going to summarize is all about. I've also been a member since 2015 of the Special Education Advisory Committee of Canada's largest school board, the Toronto District School Board. And for 2 years, 2016 and 2017, I was its chair. Finally, I'm involved, as I mentioned earlier, having served as a member of the K-12 Education Standards Development Committee appointed by the Ontario government. So I've talked about the an education accessibility standard under the AODA. What the heck is that? As I mentioned already, the Charter of Rights and the Ontario Human Rights Code guarantee important equality rights to people with disabilities, but they leave it to individuals with disabilities to have to fight barriers one at a time through individual court or tribunal applications. The idea of the AODA was to pass a law that would reduce the need for people with disabilities to have to do that. The AODA requires Ontario to become accessible to people with disabilities. Its programs, its services, its buildings, its facilities by the year 2025, 20 years after the law was passed in 2005. The AODA requires the Ontario government to lead Ontario to become accessible by that deadline. Now we're way behind because the government isn't doing enough of what it should be doing, but let me tell you what it's supposed to be doing. The way the Ontario government is supposed to get us there is by enacting a series of regulations and then enforcing them. The regulations are called accessibility standards. What an accessibility standard is supposed to be is a detailed regulation that addresses a sector of the economy, and it tells that sector which barriers they have to remove, how they got to remove them, and when they got to remove them. And it's enforceable by government action. Now, these standards don't override the Charter of Rights or the Ontario Human Rights Code. They seek to implement them. But if an accessibility standard is passed that's weaker than the Charter of Rights or the Human Rights Code, those stronger accessibility laws always prevail. We need an accessibility standard in the area of education. My coalition that I lead, the AODA Alliance, started saying that to the government back in 2009. But it took us over 7 years till the end of 2016 to get the prior Liberal government under Premier Kathleen Wynne to agree. She did agree eventually. Why do we need it? Well, because our education system has too many barriers that impede students with disabilities. Put simply, our education system is designed on a fundamental premise that nobody meant, I don't think anybody likes, but is nevertheless as prevalent as can be and is as ridiculous as can be. It is designed on the fundamental and operated on the fundamental premise that it's first and foremost for students without disabilities. Students with disabilities are treated as an afterthought. They have to try to squeeze into a system that was designed at the starting point as if they weren't even there. And the consequence is an inequitable system. What happens is we design a school system as if it's for students without disabilities, and then we tell students who don't fit in to that mold, well, we'll give you something called special education, which is kind of a shoehorn to try to shove your foot into a shoe that was never designed for you. Now, that's not to say all special education is all bad, but we need to take a closer look at it, and that's what I'm about to do now. Under the AODA, if the government decides that they want to enact an accessibility standard, they announce that they're going to. That's what happened back in 2016. And then the government's required to appoint an independent advisory committee to recommend what the standard should include. That's called a Standards Development Committee. The government appointed one in the area of K-12 education. That's the committee I was on. Its job is to make recommendations. Our final report in 2022 mapped out for the government what that regulation should include. It's then up to the government to decide how much, if any, of what we recommend should be enacted. They can do all of it, some of it, none of it. They can do additional things that we didn't even include in our report. They can also take our recommendations and enact them in a regulation or adopt them as policies or do some combination. Right now, we're at the point where the government has our advice, but hasn't said what they're going to do with it. And that is an important next step that we need to hear from the government on. So enough of all of this. What did we find and what did we recommend? Well, first, I want to describe a basic finding that was in our report that's really important. Our report, in effect, said that our education system is designed on that premise I just said, as if it was first and foremost for people, students without disabilities. In fact, students with disabilities in our Education Act are referred to as exceptional pupils. That's not meant as a compliment like, hey, you're really exceptional, you're really good. It means they're not normal. And in fact, in the old days, back in the 90s, for example, the term often was used in the education system, normal pupils, as contrasted with exceptional pupils. Now, I don't want to get obsessed with terminology, but man, that's offensive. Could you imagine a workplace that said we had normal employees and then we had women? Or we had normal employees and we had ones whose skin is not white? You'd say that's sexist, that's racist, and you'd be right. Well, to say we have normal students and then we have students with exceptionalities, or they're not normal, is exactly what our education system does. It doesn't even call them disabilities, it calls them exceptionalities. But that fundamental problem, bad enough as it is, gets even worse. Because what it does is it also does not include all disabilities within the definition of exceptional pupil. We heard back from, for example, kids with ADHD, kids with mental health conditions, and their families or organizations that support them, if their mental health condition does not rise to the level of behavior issue, these are not, in some or all parts of the province, treated as an exceptionality covered by our special education system. So they're out of luck. Even though they have complete rights under the Charter, complete rights under the Human Rights Code, our special education system leaves them out. That's wrong. It's not fair. It's not justified. The system should cover equally and serve fully students with any and all kind of disabilities. Again, that would be bad enough, but it gets even worse. The definition of exceptional pupil or exceptionality also includes some kids with absolutely no disability at all. Who is those? Exceptional pupil includes both students with certain, but not all disabilities, but also students who are gifted. Now, some gifted students have disabilities as well. They need to be supported in connection with their disabilities as part of any education strategy for students with disabilities, of course. As for gifted kids with no disabilities, of course we need to effectively provide for their education. And there's no suggestion that any of that should be cut back. But it's wrong from a matter of policy, budget, or otherwise to simply lump kids with no disability at all who are gifted into the same budget and program as kids who have disabilities. Nobody has ever come forward with a policy justification or rationale for doing so. The only answer I've ever heard when I've raised this at all levels of the Ministry of Education is that's the way we've always done it. So our report began by setting out a long-term objective. And to paraphrase it, on education accessibility standards, long-term objective is to ensure that our kindergarten to grade 12 education system fully includes and fully benefits and provides for full participation of students with disabilities in all parts of the K-12 education system, free of disability barriers. And it should also provide a fair, swift, and effective means for individual students with disabilities to have their individual learning needs that are disability related identified, accommodated, and effectively addressed. So that's the starting point. We then laid out some basic ideas and then some general themes. Here are the basic ideas. First, the education system should no longer be built on these outdated terms like exceptional pupil, exceptionality, special education, all terms that are inconsistent with the notion of treating people as equals. Instead, we should have a system that's designed to serve all students with any kind of disability and that is targeted at and designed to ensure the effective serving of students with disabilities. Undistracted, undiluted. As well, what they should get is education. That's what their right is, not special education, education. Now, again, I don't want to get hung up on terminology, but the whole idea is to view these students as and treat them as equals, deserving of equal benefit, equal concern, respect, and rights. Not as an afterthought in a system design that wasn't designed for them. The next basic starting point is this requires systemic fixes. We need to have our education system systematically identify and remove the barriers that are in it. It's not enough to just perpetuate, exacerbate those barriers and leave it for parents of students with disabilities or the students themselves to have to fight against those barriers, one parent, one school, one class at a time. That's not fair, that's not effective, and that's not right. A couple of other important starting points. Our mandate was only to talk about the publicly funded kindergarten to grade 12 education system. But we've emphasized that what we've recommended needs to also apply to and be extended to private schools and preschool education programs in which students, children with disabilities might take place. The other thing is, to be effective, these reforms should not leave it to 72 Ontario school boards to have to each reinvent the same wheel. Rather, each school board will have certain obligations, but the Ministry of the Ministry of Education has to step up the plate, show leadership, and in a number of instances that we identify, come forward with templates of policies, strategies, programs, or coordinate them themselves so each school board doesn't have to duplicate efforts and waste money in the process. Sometimes we've heard from the Ministry of Education and when it comes to students with disabilities of, oh, we want to defer to the local school boards and their sense of local needs. Well, guess what? In Ontario, a blind student is a blind student who's just as blind if they live in Kenora as if they live in Toronto or Ottawa. They each need Braille teacher support, for example, or a vision itinerant, and we need provincial standards to ensure that that's provided. It's not a matter of simply leaving it to each school board to figure that out by themselves. Now, turning to the recommendations, let me focus on a series of themes. A first theme is trying to provide a school environment that is welcoming for students with disabilities and that is free of attitudinal barriers. We made several recommendations. One was that everyone working in the education system, whether it's teachers, teachers' assistants, principals, or even staff, anyone that deals with these students or with the public needs to be properly trained on how to ensure equality, full participation for students with disabilities. For teachers, it means that they need to be trained in not just how to teach students without disabilities, but students with disabilities as well. We unfortunately have a siloed system of teacher training. You either train to be a general education teacher which means students without disabilities, or a special education teacher, which means students with disabilities. Well, that perpetuates inequality, discrimination, and segregation. We need all teachers to know how to teach all learners. As well, a strategy aimed at addressing attitudinal barriers should include having a provincially offered curriculum to educate students, all students, on inclusion of people with disabilities. If that were taught in our schools across the school system, we could go a long way to removing a lot of future barriers and ensuring a lot more equality of opportunity for all people with disabilities. But it's a good way to start in promoting a school system that is free of attitudinal barriers. As well, we recommend action to help address and educate parents of students in the school system, whether the parents of students with disabilities or not, so they also understand what the board is trying to achieve for students with disabilities and will therefore facilitate parents being supporters of that effort. Our next area, or our next theme we addressed, were barriers to digital accessibility. Now, what the heck is digital accessibility? When we say accessibility, you might think just about buildings and people in wheelchairs not being able to get in. More about that in a few minutes. But digital accessibility means it addresses learning through digital means. We all know that so much of learning is now taking place either online or using online resources or using computers in the classroom or tablets or other digital technology. A lot more school books are provided in digital format, not in paper textbooks and so on. Well, in that digital world, if that technology, if those computers, if the software, if the documents are designed to be accessible, then people with disabilities, students and teachers and parents can get full access to them. I'm a blind person, and believe me, I know when you get a document that's not accessible, our adapted computers can't read them to us. Same for students with vision loss or dyslexia or other print-related disabilities. So, and as well, and there's a lot of technology that's out there that is accessible, but what we need to do is to make sure that school boards only procure accessible technology and that their teachers and other education staff know how to use the accessibility features in them. Here's a simple example, two simple examples of fixes that would be easy to do and could have a huge impact. A lot of documents are circulating in schools and in the education system in the PDF format. That creates huge accessibility problems for people with vision loss like me, teachers, students, whoever, parents. And it is easy to ensure that when a document is provided in PDF, which is not accessible, that it's also made available in an an alternative accessible format like a Word document. Doesn't cost anything, easy to do. Too often school boards and the Ministry of Education aren't doing that. Could be easy to fix. During the pandemic, TV Ontario was identified as a major government of the Ontario government, partner of the Ontario government in delivering online learning. Problem? TV Ontario's online learning resources are replete with disability barriers, ones that are contrary to the Human Rights Code, contrary to regulations under the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, and frankly, just plain unjustified. The government should be getting those fixed. We've been urging that for, I'd say, about 2.5 years. We're still waiting. With the move to distance learning, it's important to ensure that the platform used for distance learning is accessible. Some school boards used Zoom. That's more accessible. It's pretty accessible. You use it all the time. Other platforms like WebEx, Teams, and so on are, in varying degrees, less accessible. School boards should only be using accessible platforms for distance learning. Let me turn to another important theme. We need to ensure accessibility in our curriculum and our lesson plans. Well, what am I talking about? When it comes to designing products for the consumer to use, Sometimes they're designed as if they're only going to be used by people without disabilities. But a great important new trend is to include features so that all people could use those products. That trend is called universal design. Take that idea, translate it to the classroom and to learning. What do you come up with? The goal of universal design in learning, or UDL. It's an important term of art. It's even a hashtag on Twitter. UDL involves coming up with strategies for teaching that address a full spectrum of different learning needs and learning abilities. And UDL needs to be taught to those who are going to teach. It should be a required subject for continuing professional development for teachers, PD days and so on. It needs to be a core basis for design of provincial curriculum and local curriculum, and it needs to be embedded in individual lesson plans. We recommend that. It's the modern trend in education to fully include students with disabilities, but Ontario has a lot of catch-up to do to get there. This is a good example of where the provincial government could show effective leadership by providing UDL-based resources and UDL-based curricula to school boards that they can use or opt into so that they don't have to try to figure it all out themselves. A next important theme we talked about in our report is the important theme of ensuring that there is an effective way of ensuring that individual students' disability-related learning needs are going to be effectively addressed at the school, throughout their education. There is a tool for this in our education system, but it's unduly bureaucratized, little understood by many, and needs to be substantially reformed. The tool is called the Individual Education Plan, or IEP. The idea is a good one. If you've got a child with a disability who's in school, there should be an individualized plan to ensure that their education needs are going to be met. But the problems that we see include the following. Number one, our education system does not ensure that every student who wants or needs an IEP gets an IEP. They all should get one. The second problem is school boards and the Ministry of Education have a number of different plans for students. We recommended that all the students' learning needs should be consolidated in one individual education plan. And related to this, the IEP, once arrived at, should be portable. If you go to one school to school board, work out an IEP, and then for some reason have to switch to another school at the school board, you shouldn't have to start from scratch. The IEP should go with you. And moreover, if you go from one school board to another school board in Ontario, it should go with you. And the new school board should either follow it or have to justify on pretty strict terms why they aren't going to follow it, and they should follow it until they justify any departures from it. Related to this theme is the next theme, which is strengthening parent participation in their child's education for students with disabilities. School boards and the Ministry of Education often talk about this theme and objective of parents as partners. Unfortunately, when it comes to our special education system, that rhetoric is too often not a reality. And I want to emphasize it's not because individual teachers and principals don't want it to be a reality, but because they're handcuffed by an outdated system that isn't effectively designed to meet the needs of students with disabilities. So here's a couple of examples of reforms that we've identified. We heard over and over that parents of students with special education needs too often find it incredibly difficult to find out the most basic information from their school boards about what options are available for their child, what class placements are available, what supports are available, who to go to talk about it, how to explore them, how to advocate for them. In other words, it's like going to a restaurant that won't give you a menu. Parents shouldn't have to fight for this information. We made detailed recommendations on what needs to be done to ensure that parents have speedy, effective, and easy to access information on what's available for students with disabilities, how to access it, and who to talk to about it, and where to go if you have any concerns. The next thing is that we identified is that parents of students with disabilities are supposed to have some input or be consulted on the contents of an individual education plan, but we don't have a fair process in place to ensure this happens. For example, as just one example, in the U.S., parents of students with disabilities are entitled to have what's called IEP meeting with the school board to discuss what should be in the individual education plan. Ontario does not assure that to parents of students with disabilities and does not require schools to offer such a meeting, or much less to encourage one. Now, parents who know that they can ask will ask, and we'd hope that they'd get an IEP meeting to have these discussions. But too many parents don't even know to ask, and therefore won't ask, and therefore will be left out of the process. We recommend that IEP meetings should be assured if requested, and that they should be widely offered to parents so that they know that they have that avenue. Next, we identified that there's a serious problem. Even if you go to an IEP meeting, what happens if you don't agree with the school board on what the IEP should include? You want something added, they don't want to put it in. Or what happens if they write up an IEP that you like, but then you find out that the school board isn't complying with some part of it? There is no assured process for appealing these issues within the school board. You're left to either go to the Human Rights Tribunal, hire lawyers, but spend years in litigation and face school boards lawyered up at taxpayers' subsidy to cover their legal costs, not yours, if you're the parent. It's not an effective system. There is an internal process for raising things with the superintendent, but it doesn't ensure that there is a fair, effective decision and an attempt to mediate or resolve it. And it doesn't assure that it goes to people who are independent of the original decisions and who have expertise in the learning needs and the education of students with disabilities. We make detailed recommendations on how to fix all of that. If you want to learn more about this whole area of what more we could do for parents, I've actually recorded a video, which I'll put in the notes for this video, for this lecture, which provides tips for parents on how to advocate for their children's needs at school. And on the subject of helping parents know more about how to navigate the system, an important topic of recommendations by the K-12 Standards Development Committee, I actually created that video to try to help get that process underway. I'm happy to say it's been seen by hundreds of people and gotten lots of great feedback from parents, school boards, school board administrators. What I'd really like to see is that video, a link to that video sent to every single parent of every student with a disability in the entire Ontario education system. That would go a good way towards helping get this problem, if not solved, then at least to get a change started in this important area of breathing meaning into the expression parents as partners. I'm going to address a number of other themes really quickly, not because they're not important, but because it's important to cover them all if I can. A next theme that we addressed is that the process under the Ontario special education system for deciding overall how a student's disability-related needs are going to get met is fragmented, out of date, and deeply problematic. The decision on where the child will go is called placement, or what kind of program there will be is called placement, and it's decided by something called the Identification and Placement Review Committee, or IPRC. But decisions on what's going to be what the child's actual needs are and what services and supports that are going to be met are not decided there. It's splintered. Instead of deciding first what the student needs and then deciding collectively in one-stop shopping where the student should learn and what supports they should get, this is splintered across more than one place. It's incredibly confusing. It's wasteful of school board time. It needs substantial reform. We point out the need for those reforms and the principles that should guide them. Our next theme, which is going to sound kind of like inside baseball school board administration, but school boards and the Ministry of Education need to build in a way to ensure that accessibility, full inclusion, barrier-free environment is part of the way they do business. Not just policies they post on their website, but what they actually do. We make several recommendations. The Ministry of Education should have an assistant deputy minister solely responsible for accessibility and barrier-free education for students with disabilities. Believe it or not, they don't. Each school board should have a senior public official whose job is to be the chief accessibility officer for the school board. As well, each school board's elected trustees, the politicians that form what's called, in effect, the board of directors, should have an accessibility committee that oversees the board's activities on this entire subject. As well, we recommend that each local school should have its own accessibility committee, combination of staff and parents and volunteers that can look at ways to solve problems locally or make recommendations to the school board more centrally. The next thing we identify is that there are some disability-specific needs that need to be explored and addressed. I'll give you just one example that I know a lot about. When some students have have disabilities that are more numerous in the school board system, in the school system, excuse me, and for some, they're called low incidence. That means there's very few of them. One of these are students with vision loss. Students who are blind or deafblind or low vision or blind or low vision plus other disabilities as well. And our education system has a local team of experts who specialize in this. They're called Teachers of the Visually Impaired. But we have lots of problems. Ontario lags way behind much of the rest of Canada, most of the US, and a number of countries. Our training standards are way too low, and we don't ensure a reliable number of teachers of the visually impaired at school boards to ensure that their students' needs will be met. And the Ministry of Education doesn't track, monitor, or enforce any of this. So we recommend that in that area and a number of others, there needs to be concerted effort. Our next theme relates to the right to just be at school. Now, on the one hand, it's great that the Education Act says that every student has the right to an education, but our Education Act goes on to give school principals the authority, indeed the duty, to exclude students from school if their behavior or their presence might be adverse to the physical or mental well-being of people at school and to students at school. And this has been used disproportionately for principals to exclude, refuse to admit some students with disabilities to school, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months. Under the current law, the principal isn't required to give reasons or set an end date or have a plan to bring the student back to school or provide for education away from school if they're not letting them come to school. Totally unfair, arbitrary system. And if they do allow them to come to school, they can unilaterally decide that they won't let them come for full school days. They can shorten their school day unilaterally, arbitrarily, without reasons. We make detailed recommendations on how this should be fixed. And this came after my coalition, the AODA Alliance, surveyed all school boards and showed sweeping, arbitrary, radical differences between practices and policies around the province in this area. Unjustified that depending on where you go to school in the province, you could be subject to more or less protection against this arbitrary practice. We make recommendations in certain other theme areas to ensure that in social activities that students with disabilities are fully included, such as off-site educational programming, to ensure that students with disabilities get a full chance to equally participate in experiential learning, co-op placements. We're worried that too often students with disabilities, or some of them, may be told, oh, we can't find you an accessible placement, so we'll just waive the requirement that you do a co-op placement. We're concerned that disproportionately students with disabilities have to rely on school board transportation services, and yet these can be unreliable and subject to real and significant barriers. Regulations in place to date have not effectively addressed that. We suggested ways they could be beefed up. Another theme area we addressed is the right of students with disabilities to bring their service animal to school. This typically comes up with kids with autism spectrum disorder. The provincial government sent out a memo to all school boards telling them to have a policy, but it didn't prescribe with anywhere near the kind of specifics what that policy needed to include. We've proposed what that should include and urged that this be included in the regulation that the government should pass under the AODA. We also, in the light of the experience with COVID, we found that students with disabilities were disproportionately harmed by the whole COVID experience when it came to access to learning during school shutdowns, during remote learning. We suggested steps that should be taken to prevent this from happening again, protections that should be in place. And among other things, we said that each school board should have a rapid action response team ready to deal with disability-related needs during an emergency. And that what we really need right now is an independent review of how students with disabilities were adversely affected during the pandemic, so it could make more recommendations beyond those we put forward. A major theme that we addressed, as I'm getting near the end of these themes, is the built environment. Too often our schools are not designed to be accessible to students, teachers, parents, other members of the public with a disability, whether it's a physical disability, using a wheelchair, vision loss, someone like me, hearing loss, or many other disabilities. Now, you might think, doesn't the building code covers this? Well, sadly, the building code's accessibility provisions are far out of date and totally inadequate. Similarly, standards passed under the AODA to date have not effectively addressed this. We provide 20 pages of what an accessible school should look like. In other words, we provide, if you will, a mini building code for schools. These are recommendations that would be useful for designing any new schools. And as I record this, the government's spending hundreds of millions on funding the building construction of new schools. We also think that these can be used as a guidepost for retrofitting or renovating existing schools where readily achievable. So we provide the roadmap of how to do that where no one else sadly has today. I want to address two more themes that we addressed. This is a hard school system to navigate for parents of students with disabilities and the students themselves. We heard that over and over. It's hard when you're going into the school system, when you're transitioning from elementary to secondary school, when you're going from high school to either university or other post-secondary education, or to community living and employment. Students with disabilities and their families desperately need transition system navigators to navigate each stage of the process. And we make detailed recommendations on how this can be achieved. It will be helpful to everybody in the system: the students, the parents, the families, the schools themselves, everybody involved. Our final theme relates to the issue of compliance and enforcement. All of these ideas are great, but how do you make them happen? Up until now, we learned that the Ministry of Education does not see itself as being in an enforcement role when it comes to ensuring that school boards effectively serve the needs of students with disabilities. Now, I could make a lot of editorial comments on that, but let's just say that's got to change. So we make recommendations about the need for on-site audits, for accountability, for ensuring that school boards and the Ministry of Education do what is required of them. Effective enforcement is a core underpinning to make the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act work. So all of this sounds great. Anybody listening to this is probably nod their head, and the reactions might be two things. One, how do you make all this happen? And two, Man, this sounds overwhelming. This is a lot of stuff that needs to be done. Well, let me give you a bit of a roadmap of how all this could turn into action. First, we need, of course, for the Ontario government as soon as possible to develop and enact an actual education accessibility standard for kindergarten to grade 12. They've had more than half a year since they received our final report, but they knew what that report was going to include for months and months and months, if not years before that, because government officials were closely involved in attending our various Standards Development Committee meetings. They've been briefed at all levels on it, and it's just a question of whether they're going to take action, and they're going to do so in a timely way. But even in advance of that, pretty much everything I've just described could, in the interim, be addressed through policy reform, through the government setting policy requirements for school boards, even if they haven't yet enacted them in regulations. Now, I speaking for myself, I have to say, policies are always great, but they don't have the permanence and the enforceability of a regulation. So that's just a starting point to get us going now. For example, the Ministry of Education could tomorrow direct all school boards that no student will be excluded from school, will be refused an admission to school under the powers I described earlier in this presentation, without giving them a reason, without setting a time limit, without putting in place a plan to educate them remotely, and without establishing a plan for return to school. They can do that tomorrow. It should eventually be incorporated in the law, but there's no reason not to do that now. Another step that can be taken, I've talked so far about the Ministry of Education, but the Ministry of Education is not the only player that matters here. School boards are in a position to make a huge difference. It's one thing that can and should happen immediately, in fact, should have happened 6 months ago, is school board senior officials should take the K-12 Standards Development Committee final report, review it, tick off the things that they think should be done, do a short list of things that they think they can be done right away or should be a priority, and get to work on it. They should also connect up with other school boards to see what they're doing so that they don't have to each reinvent the same wheel. Another step where this report can be very helpful is this. Every school board that's publicly funded in Ontario is required to have what's called a Special Education Advisory Committee. I mentioned before that I'm a member of the Special Education Advisory Committee for the Toronto District School Board, Canada's largest school board. Well, those Special Education Advisory Committee, the short form is SEAC, each SEAC can and should review the K-12 report and should pass recommendations to the school board on what they think should be done now. I can tell you that for our part, the Special Education Advisory Committee of the Toronto District School Board set up its own K-12 subcommittee, reviewed the report, and presented 3 immediate recommendations to the board. In fact, we did this back last spring of 2022. We said that, number one, the board should immediately act on recommendations to come up with a strategy to let parents know what's available on the menu, what's available for their children, or their by way of placements, programs, services, supports, and how to advocate for them. Second, we recommended that some kind of internal fair appeal process should be established where there's a dispute over what the individual education plan should include, or over if there's a dispute over whether it's even being effectively implemented. And finally, we said that the school board of trustees should establish a board-level accessibility committee. Now, so far, as of the time I'm recording this, on October 2nd, 2022, the TDSB has had the report from the ministry, the K-12 report, but it's also had the recommendations from SEAC, and so far has come forward with nothing in the way of a plan of action. That can and should change. But this is a tool which special education advisory committees can use. Finally, it's open to teachers' unions, other people interested in education issues, disability organizations, community advocates, anyone, to use this report as a basis to put pressure on school boards and on the Minister of Education to take action now to implement this report. Now, an immediate reaction that I fear some people will have with all of this, especially if you work at a school board or at the Ministry of Education, is, oh my God, there's so much to do here. I don't even know where to start. This is overwhelming. Let me solve that concern. Number one, it's important to take action as soon as possible. So one of the easiest things to do is go through and pick the easiest to do, the most readily achievable, the highest impact actions first. Number two, don't worry about doing everything before you do anything. Sometimes in government, they want the comprehensive plan and every last detail worked out before they start anything. That makes all of this take years longer. What we've found, and this is my final point, number three, is that when it comes to making progress on accessibility, every little step forward helps, and every step forward propels you to greater confidence on other steps forward. So, put simply, don't be overwhelmed. Just get started somewhere. Let me conclude with just some helpful resources for you. If you want to learn more about this, first, go to the AODA Alliance website's education page. I'll spell it out for you. It's www.aodaalliance.org/education. There you can see the final report of the K-12 Standards Development Committee. You can see a lot of the steps that went on to lead up to its approval and other key resources. As well, I encourage you to watch on YouTube the talk I gave on tips for parents on how to effectively advocate for students with disabilities at school that I referred to earlier. As well, and I'll link this also to this video, I have a video online which gives an introductory guide to the duty to accommodate people with disabilities on the under the Ontario Human Rights Code. It's not specifically aiming exclusively at education, but everything in there will provide you with useful information that's applicable to the school setting. So if you've heard of the duty to accommodate people with disabilities, but don't exactly know what it means, who it applies to, what it requires, what it doesn't require, go check that out. Of course, it's important to read the K-12 Standards Development Committee's final report. Also on our education page, aodaalliance.org/education, is a 15-page summary and a 55-page summary of the initial or draft report of the K-12 Standards Development Committee. Now, those summaries are still applicable, valid, and they may not leave a couple of points out, but if you don't have time to read the whole Standards Development Committee report, but you want to look at them in a 15-page or 55-page summary, they're available. Finally, contact the AODA Alliance. We can't give advice to parents on how to advocate for individual student needs, but we are there to receive feedback, and also you can learn about what we're up to. To connect with us, go to www.aodaalliance.org. There's a sign-up link on our homepage. Plug in your email, and you'll get email updates from us. We're also on Twitter at AODA Alliance. And finally, we're on Facebook. If you just go to Facebook and look for facebook.com/ and I think it's Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance. It may be /AODA Alliance. Facebook keeps changing things, so it's hard to keep track. Anyway, let me end where I began. Up until this report came along, there has, in our lifetimes in Ontario, been no comprehensive review of the education system in Ontario to find out how effectively it's serving students with disabilities and what needs to change so that they can be fully included in and fully benefit from and fully participate in the K-12 education system. That review has now taken place. The recommendations are powerful ones, they're ambitious but practical ones, and more important, they're recommendations that are not just from the disability community, but jointly from appointees approved by the Liberal and later Conservative governments in Ontario, from the disability community and the educational community on a footing of parity, 50-50, and as a result of our public consultations, substantial public input showing that we were right in the barriers we identified, we were right in the barriers in the solutions we proposed. Now it's time for the government to act. Thank you very much.